morning. My name is Roberto Echandi. I'm the global lead for investment policy and promotion of the World Bank Group, and I want to thank the AIM for giving us the chance to be with you today. What I'm going to do in this brief presentation basically is to refer to this document that most of you have already in your hands, and I want to basically give you kind of a background of where does it come from and what the World Bank is trying to do. Today, as you know, we are living in a very complex world. There's a lot of questioning about whether globalizations are really serving citizens and all the reforms that governments are undertaking are actually working. So part of our work here was to basically respond to that challenge also by enabling governments to deal with what type of reforms can countries do according to political cycles, 3-4 years, and actually measure the results of the reforms that governments undertake. It's extremely important for governments to know and to have evidence-based policymaking. It's extremely important for governments to be able to show investors and private citizens how is the actions that they are undertaking working. And in the area of investment, it's not an easy task at all, because investment policy is a subject, contrary to others, that is very horizontal. A lot of subjects have to deal with investment policy. Investment policy touches upon trade, services, labor, infrastructure, education, taxes, etc. So part of the challenge that governments have to face when they're talking about investment and dealing with FDI is that they are dealing with many topics at the same time. And when they deal with many topics, you also have many agencies involved and many variables that some of them are under control of governments, but some of them are not. So in this context, the key question that we were asked in the World Bank was basically, in addition to all the reports and all the analytics that we do, how could we develop a tool to enable these governments have a framework to organize their ideas and to translate those ideas in concrete actions that could be undertaken in 2, 3, 4 years max, and then measure the impact of those reforms that they undertaken. So these are the key points that we want to share with you today. We designed what is called the Investment Policy and Promotion Logical Framework and a series of toolkits to frame these actions to be actually implemented by the governments. So we had to start first also by a way of thinking, and the first challenge that we had is how can we organize the ideas? How we connect all the dots that we are saying? So we came up with a framework that has 3 key basic propositions. And actually this is a very good test, because the test that we were asked by the World Bank was, let's try to do it as simple as possible, so everybody can understand it very quickly and also have a more sophisticated discussion on investment, but at the same time keep it simple. So there are 3 key ideas here that our logical framework uses as a base for departure. The first one is that, traditionally speaking, a lot of countries, when they think about investment policy, there's a dilemma that a lot of countries have had, and is whether they should privilege domestic investment or foreign investment, assuming that it's in the best interest of development to address this question, assuming that you have to choose. And basically here, we have our research shows that that's a very false dilemma. And let me actually, I will drill on why. The second idea is that a lot of countries think that all FDI basically is a homogeneous phenomenon. We tend to talk about investment and investment in different sectors as FDI was all the same, and it's not. There are different types of FDI. It's not the same to talk about mining than to talk about an FDI in hotels, than to talk about MDI in research and development, than to talk about FDI in car manufacturing. So yet, if you see all the literature, you see all the research, there tends to be either too specific or too general, and we don't differentiate between the types of FDI. The third point is that when we talk about investment, there's a tendency for governments to think that investment is about attracting investment. Basically, that once you attract investment, the spillovers will flow automatically. And as we will discover, that's not the case. A lot of countries have attracted FDI for a long time, and yet they are not developed. So why? Why is that happening? So what I want to do in the next 2 minutes is precisely to drill in these 4 ideas and explain how we are organizing these ideas and how are we trying to land it and work with governments in promoting these reforms that have leading to measurable results. So on the first one, on this first idea, whether to choose between FDI or domestic investment in this false dilemma. Why is it a false dilemma? Well, let me tell you, 400 years ago, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the gap between the richest country in the planet and the poorest was 4 times. In other words, the 4th richest country in the planet was 4 times richer than the poorest. Today, that gap has increased almost by 400. Yet, we are living in a paradox world, because at the same time that the gap is increasing, the poverty is decreasing. So we have never had less poverty. That's also an important achievement. So what is happening, though? We have less poor people, but at the same time, we have higher gaps. What explains? What makes countries prosper or not prosper? Well, what we discovered is that 400 years ago, we didn't have computers, we didn't have microphones, we didn't have this kind of electric light, we didn't have all this knowledge that is manifested in goods and services that are produced today. In other words, countries grow because they produce new things, or because they develop new processes in producing the old things. And that's that know-how, that's the technology, and you probably will say that that's quite obvious, that we already have known for a long time the importance of education, which is totally true. Mind you, what we have discovered in our research is that a lot of countries then have opted to say, well, this is solved by just increasing the years of schooling of our population. So a lot of governments spent more money in university education and in primary education and technical education, and that's fine. I don't want to criticize that. The problem or the challenge is that we found that there's no direct link between income per capita and productivity, in particular, with the years of schooling. In other words, there's a lot of countries like Ghana that have increased a lot the years of schooling, yet the productivity is not growing. And a lot has to do that today, in order to learn how to do things, the way the human brain works is very, very important. I can be a PhD in engineering, and I yet will not know how to make this machine. I need to work with someone who knows how to make this little machine to learn how to use it. Human beings learn by working together. Human beings learn by empirical learning. It's like sometimes there's a theoretical learning, but there's an empirical learning too. It's like learning how to ride a bike. I can read a book of how to ride a bike, but until I ride it, I learn how to do it. And what is the practical implication of this? That today, if we say that humans learn by interacting with other humans, the investments become the new schools of the future. When you have FDI coming into countries, when you have knowledge coming from abroad and locals learning how to do things, that people learn how to do things. Today, there are a lot of countries in this fair today that are showing how their exports are diversifying, and a lot has to do with FDI. Well, that's exactly the process. The know-how comes, and the nationals begin to do these new services, these new goods that they didn't know how to produce. But for that is movement of people. And this is extremely important because these people are the investors and the technical know-how that these investors bring. What is the policy conclusion? That if we still continue then to think that we have to choose between domestic investments or FDI, we are then addressing the false dilemma. If I am a developing country and I want my people to live better, I have to produce new goods and new services, and I need my own people to learn how to do that. For that, FDI is necessary. It's not an ideological debate. It's a fact. And this is particularly important because look at the graphic that we have in the screen. The main source of financing is FDI. But my point here is that the main benefit of FDI is not only the capital. The main benefit of FDI today is the know-how, enabling these people to work together. And that's extremely important because it's a major policy shift. Because that means that the more nationalistic you are, the more concerned about your own people you are, the more open to FDI you should be. Not the other way around. The second idea is that there are different types of investment with different impacts of development. And therefore, that there's a need for a more nuanced policy making. And this is the point that I was telling to you. When we talk about FDI, there has been a tradition to refer to the term like if all FDI was the same. That's not the case. So we basically are borrowing a typology that was developed by a British economist, John Dunning, in the 1960s, but he never imagined how useful that typology was going to be. Originally, he basically was trying to answer the question, why investors go to a country, why investment happens. And then he identified four main pull factors or push factors for investors to go somewhere else. One is to exploit natural resources, right? The natural resources are not evenly located in the world. So when you are an investor that wants to exploit oil, well, certainly there's a push to come to the Gulf countries where there's a lot of oil, or the parts of the world where oil is. So natural resource-seeking investment is a very typical type of FDI that the pool or the countries more interesting or more attractive for these investments are the countries that have the highest amount or the best quality of the natural resource. But that's only one type of investment. And this type of investment generates certain particular socioeconomic effects, right? The second type of investment is an investment when investors will go to a country not to exploit natural resources, but to sell goods and services there. Which are the countries that are more attractive for this? Countries with big markets, or countries with markets with higher rising incomes, because then the market is growing. So this type of investment will be flowing to some countries, not to all. The third type of investment is what we call efficiency-seeking investment. And this type of investment is going to countries not to exploit natural resources, not to sell goods and services there, but it's basically export-oriented investment. It's investors that will come to countries to export somewhere else as part of the global value chains that actually my colleagues were referring to before my presentation. And last but not least, we have what we call a strategic asset-seeking investment, which is basically investment that motivates firms to acquire strategic assets, that is brands, or the designs, or slots, or routes, airlines, for example, and that's the main reason why these companies move. So for example, when Tata Industries decides to penetrate the car luxury market, the decision is, no, they buy Land Rover and they buy Jaguar as a strategic asset. When Tata Land buys that, they are buying the whole knowledge, people, design, outlets, everything. And those are the strategic assets that enable this firm to go away. Now, all this is the four types of investments. The key interesting find that we discovered is that behind each type of investment, we discovered something that done in typology was even more useful, because there are different types of socioeconomic impacts that this type of investment generates. The natural resource generates certain problems that are not present in the others. For example, in natural resource, you have the environmental issues, you have the issue of who gets the rents, who gets the benefits. This type of investment usually generates certain trade patterns, generates patterns by which countries export commodities and import manufacturing goods. In market-seeking investment, that has a different challenges, but even also historically, from the perspective of developing countries, this typology is extremely useful because today, we have the four types, and some countries have the four, some countries have the two, but historically, from the perspective of developing country, there's a sequence. A lot of countries have started to relate into globalization to the world by natural resource-seeking investment. They have later tried to attract market-seeking investment, and then now are going to efficiency-seeking, and then also now to outward investment. 39% of the world of investment today, of FDI in the world, comes from developing countries or economies in transition. So this is a very important point. Now, I will finish this, but the key point that we want to illustrate is that the attitudes in the political economy in different countries towards FDI has a lot to do with the history. So if you go to a country that has only received natural resource-seeking investment, it's very likely that the attitudes will be very different from countries that have only received up to date efficiency-seeking or market-seeking investment. So the problems that we find is that governments, when they talk about policies, they have their policies tailor-made for the kind of investment that they have received more, but not for the type of investment they want to receive in the future. And that's part of the recipe that we want to address on policymaking. Why is this differentiation so important? Because as I told you in the very beginning, governments are dealing with how to improve the level of living of their people. This is a graphic that shows us the type of jobs that each type of activity generates. The ones in black shows us the low-skilled household jobs, the gray low-skilled, and the dark blue is the knowledge intensive, the better paid jobs. So you see here that in agriculture, the majority of the jobs tend to be low skilled, and there's a fraction of high skilled jobs. In apparel, the thing begins to change, automotive, IT hardware, and business services. You see that there's almost an indirect correlation. The more you go to the right, the more type of jobs are generated in higher income parts. So this is extremely important to understand because different types of investment generate different types of jobs. So if the duty of a government is to make their people live better, here is the numbers that show you the political economy equation on how to diversify the economy, right? Now, how do we get there? And that's the key point. How do we land then this notion of how to maximize the benefits of different types of investment? Well, we discovered that we have to we developed the notion of the investment cycle. It's an investor-centric logic because it's basically when the relationships between investors and governments are really not a transaction, it's a relationship. When investors go to a country, they go to a country thinking in a long term. Usually longer periods than a government administration. In a lot of countries, governments change every 4 years, every 5 years, every 7 years. Investments tend to outlive governments, and that's part of the problem, or the challenge. Not a problem, it's a challenge. So then a lot of governments traditionally have been thinking in that the issue about FDI is about attracting FDI, and then if you attract FDI, the spillovers or benefits will come automatically. Well, in the World Bank, we have learned that it's not so easy. There's some need for some policies to maximize the potential of FDI. So we developed this logic of the cycle that starts with having a vision and a strategy, and it's basically to enable a country to understand what type of investment that they're receiving, what amount of investment that they are receiving, and what are the policy implications of that. But then there's the first phase of investment attraction. A lot of countries first have to attract investment, and for that, they use promotion services or they use locational incentives. Then, it's not only enough to attract investment, you have to enable the investment to entry. Paradoxically, a lot of countries have spent millions of dollars attracting investors, and once the investors knocks the door and wants to do business, the governments themselves said, no, you can't. Sorry, you cannot enter. Either because it's forbidden for FDI, or if it's open, you have a lot of procedures that are so difficult to make that the investors basically move on and go to another country. But then let's assume that investors enter the country. That's where the relationship really starts. And that's why we have discovered that there's a big vacuum in policy in a lot of, in the world, discussion of investment today. And it's that once the investment is established, you still have to enable time for this investment to expand operations and to grow. Well, we have discovered that 25% of all investment that enters into economies in transition and developing countries stops expanding or leaves altogether because of problems of regulatory conduct. In other words, political risk today is generated not so much for terrorism or for civil unrest. Political risk, believe it or not, is generated by governments themselves. So we have basically, as I will explain in 2 minutes, is basically conducts of adverse regulatory changes, breach of contract, expropriations, problems of transfers. So you will actually ask why? Why governments that want to attract investment are the ones pushing investors away? Well, the reason is very simple. Governments are not monolithic. The agencies that attract investors are some types of agencies, but the investors have to deal with every other agency in the government. This is like when you go and marry into a family, you have to deal with your partner, but also with your in-laws. And guess what? 70% of all the problems with investors are generated by the in-laws in countries. And that end in a lot of divorces, because every time that we have investors leaving, that's a divorce. And that, of course, prevents the most important phase of investment, which is the linkages, which is the offsprings, which is how the FDI basically needs time to get rooted with the local businesses, where this transformation actually will happen. So how do we work with this? How do we translate this into a concrete action plan leading to governments to measure results? Well, basically, we work in toolkits in each part of the cycle. So we basically start working with what we call the investment reform map, which is an exercise to empower a reform one of those reform champions within governments, and then we give all the analytics in making them understand what type of investment the country receives. Are they receiving enough investment vis-a-vis comparators or benchmarking? How does it mean, what does it mean? And then we help use that dialogue to craft a minimum consensus, what we call an investment reform agenda, to be used to be executed in 3 years, 4 years max. And for each item of that reform agenda, we have an indicator to measure success. So that's what we call the investment reform map. What are the different then parts of the elements of that reform map? Well, we go topic by topic. In attraction, we start with investment promotion. So what we do is to basically benchmark the country and not only enable them to get their act together in having a very specialized agency providing investment promotion services, but also measuring how effective is the country in the type of services that they have to do. There's a lot of resources spent on promotion that are not well targeted. There is a lot of resources that are spent in promotion that go to the drain because sometimes the specialized agencies that are supposed to speak the language of investors actually are also regulators. So you have a conflict of interest. If you are a regulator, you have to control the investors. If you are a promoter, you have to make investors easy to do business. So all that is what we basically do. These are examples of success, just to show you how the tools and the things work. In the case of Rajasthan, we basically help. We work with IPA of Rajasthan, unlocking 300 million of investment generated in a period of 3 years. So basically, by enabling, facilitating these investment transactions, we measure all the transactions, and this is the number that the IPAs can show to the government and to the public to show how much investment is being generated or how many jobs are being generated as well. The same case is another project we had in Brazil, a very similar case, in which case in 3 years, we unlocked investments for $1.3 billion. So you can imagine that this is the kind of data that citizens want to hear. This is the time they want to know how many jobs and where are these jobs created. So that's actually what these tools enable the governments to do. Then we go to incentives. There's a big discussion, and today you will have another discussion on incentives. Governments think that you have to provide a lot of incentives in order to attract investment. Well, we have discovered that not all the types of investments are equally receptive to incentives. In particular, remember, we have to differentiate. There's a big differentiation that we do between what we call locational incentives, which are incentives that are aimed at influencing the investor's locational decisions. And on there, we have discovered that in natural resource seeking and in market seeking, the incentives are less needed. Why? Because countries that are very rich in natural resources, they don't need to spend a lot of money to attract investment looking for natural resources. They already are attractive enough. They have a lot of pull factor. The same with market seeking investment. If you are China, if you're Indonesia, if you have a big market, you don't need incentives to attract investors there, locational incentives, right? But for efficiency seeking, it's a different story. Because efficiency seeking, the investment will flow only to the extent that countries are competitive. Right? Now, there's a big mistake, and a lot of countries think that you can become competitive by providing incentives. That's really not the case. You cannot compensate your level of competitiveness by giving grants. So what we do in particular? On incentives, what we do basically is 4 things. The first thing that we do is basically to do a mapping. A lot of countries don't even are aware of all the incentives that are granted. So we do a mapping and an inventory. Then we see how open and transparent the incentives are. Incentives has been one of the main headaches for some countries in terms of corruption, in terms of allocation of resources. So we see what is the level of discretion, how automatic, how transparent they are. We have data that shows that investors feel very comfortable when there's transparency and predictability. When incentives are negotiated on a case-by-case basis under the table, that actually is counterproductive. It might be good for one investor, it will be very bad for the rest of investors who want to enter the country. After we measure the procedures, we do what we call the cost-benefit optimization. We have tools that basically tell you, are incentives working? Are you spending your money well? Are they well targeted? And that's basically what we try to do on this toolkit. A clear example of this is the case of Sierra Leone that we helped a few years ago. In Sierra Leone, most of the incentives used to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. It took 6 months for every investor to enter the country because had to negotiate with some officials on a case-by-case basis the conditions that they were going to receive. And of course, that generated a lot of problems, not only in terms of transparency, but also in revenue. Well, basically, when we worked with them, we came up and we basically made them transparent, made them automatic, and you will see here the curve. The curve of the darkest line shows you the increase of investment after the incentives were made automatic rather than discretionary. And even you will see that the light blue curve shows you the amount of revenue. So after the reform, not only there was more investment, but also there was more revenue by rationalizing the incentives. And investors felt much more comfortable with that. Then we go to investment entry. I will go very fast because you have, in this document, you have the explanation of all these cases and all the tools. But on investment entry, we focus basically on three kinds of barriers: legal barriers, procedural barriers, and de facto barriers. And here that examples, we worked with the government of Turkey more than 10 years ago. And here we show that we basically eliminated the screening and eliminated some restrictions that Turkey used to have. And the success of Turkey is beyond any doubt. In 2004, there was a new investment code generated, and it has been an increase of $1.47 billion. Now, we are not claiming that we generated that amount. We claim only a little percentage. So imagine if just by eliminating the screening process, we can count 10 or less than 10% of these. We're talking about $100 million derived just from making it easy for investors to enter. The second example here is Iberia, where basically we helped them to work during the WTO accession in order to actually open. They had 26 sectors closed to FDI, and we managed to reduce them to 10. So you see the light blue curve when you see the increase on investment as a result of the opening of the economy. Then I just will begin to wrap up here, talking about the most important, well, one of the most important topics, not because it's important, it's because it's usually the most ignored. And it's that the idea that is about retention and expansion. As I said today, most of the investment that actually generates change or increases comes from investors already in the country. In countries like Sweden or Korea, 75% of the new investment, not only for investments, but new, come from investors already there. So what it means is that you not only have to attract new investors, you have to keep investors happy. And this is extremely important because if you want long-term relationships, the investors are the best promoters of a country. We have also data that shows that once investors come into the country, over time, they tend to evolve into more higher value-added activities. So for example, as we will see later, the case of Intel in Costa Rica, in Intel in 1996, they opened a manufacturing facility of microchips in Costa Rica. 10 years later, they're already designing the chips there. Once investors get comfortable and they trust the country, they dare to go for higher value-added activities. So what do we do here in order to enable countries to retain investment? The first thing is that we focus on the regulatory framework. We see the investment laws, but also the treaties. We make sure that there are no gaps between international obligations and domestic laws. The second thing that we do is how to make the countries get their act together to implement in the ground all the protections that are in the books. So there we discovered, as I told you, that 70% of the investment problems are generated by other agencies. So there's an issue of coordination. So we developed what we call the Systemic Investment Response Mechanism, which is a very simple idea. We basically check who is the reform champion in a country, and we help this agency to coordinate with all the other agencies that deal with investments. When the investor has a problem, we consider that investment that is at risk. It's at risk of not expanding or at risk of leaving, and we have a scale how to measure that. But then if we solve a problem, that investment is no longer at risk. So what it means is that if governments get their act together and solve problems very early on, we can generate data on investment retained and expanded, and on jobs kept and expanded, shifting then the political economy of the incentives for agencies to do the right thing. So this idea we developed in the World Bank, and we started to do some pilots right now. So this is a case in Georgia, for example. In 1 year, we have been working with the investment ombudsman, and only with problems of 30 companies in Georgia, they managed to retain $300 million in investment in 12 months. So that's a way to measure and to basically have data that shows that it pays to actually be predictable, and it pays to be transparent, and it pays to enable the investors to stay. Another example is Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this is a very interesting example because it was a subnational level. It was a little province, a little district actually in a province in Bosnia. You know that Bosnia is a very small country but very complex. There are two republics. Each republic has cantons, and each canton has districts. So here there was the story of a major who in 2008 was very worried that because of the European crisis, a lot of investments were going to leave the country. So he called us and basically said, how can we help to keep the jobs here? Because he was very intelligent, and he realized that in his district, like 80% of the jobs were generated by around 7 companies alone. And if the companies left, people will no longer have jobs, and he will be in trouble. So to make a long story short, we started to work on this term with him, and then it was a different way. In this case, we was proactive. The major went to visit the investors. In the very beginning, they were terrified because every time the government knocks the door of an investor, investors think that is to inspect them and to do some verification of something. And no, in this case, the mayor said, we are here to help you. We want to know what would it take for you to create 2 more jobs. And the interesting phenomenon was that then all the agencies in the country began to participate in this network. And to make a long story short, we have here the numbers. I cannot read here, but there were more than 252 visits. And today we have more than 750 jobs created as a result of the expansion of investments in Bosnia. You can imagine that this mayor was re-elected and was extremely popular. So this is a micro case of things that we can do in the future, right? So to wrap up, we also then, in addition to retention and expansion, we work on linkages. And this is very important because the whole point of investment is to enable the domestic private sector also to learn new things, to upgrade, to grow. And here the challenge that we have seen is that a lot of countries think that that is a recipe to do only by law. In other words, by mandating local content, everything will happen automatically. And actually, we know they have evidence that that's not how it works. It's actually the other way around. If you force investors to source locally from local producers that do not have the quality or the quantity of inputs that are required, you are going to lose the investment. Let me give you an example. If I manage to attract Walmart into a country X, and I say, Walmart, you are in my country. I mean, first of all, if Walmart comes, it's because Walmart thinks that it will be useful to locate in my country. But if I force them to source 100% of the inputs locally, the first thing that Walmart will do is, okay, fine, I want to do it. Show me, do you have a producer that can produce 5 million T-shirts in 1 week? So if you can't, and you force them to do it, what you're generating is a market of signatures and generating corruption in the aid to comply with the local content. I'm oversimplifying here, but that's a case that we see every day. So what we're doing here? We're working with 3 things. The first thing is we work with what we develop databases to enable investors know who is in the country, what is the price of their outputs, what is the quantity that they have, just to even know what is available. 2, we help in promoting all these services to get matchmaking, and also to be open that even sometimes the suppliers may be another investor that comes, because this is a very important point. Sometimes one big investor brings other investors as a cluster. And 3, we work on what we called behavioral incentives. In other words, what are the programs that governments can do in order to quickly upgrade the capacity of the local suppliers in order to be able to supply to that FDI. And of course, what we measure here, that the indicator that we have here is the number of businesses and the number of transactions that are made. So with this, I finish. I just went very quickly. I would invite you to read this little booklet that kindly the organizers of the conferences help us to prepare. But we are here starting to work with many governments. We started 3 years ago. We had 5 projects 3 years ago. Today we have 81. Of different types in all the regions of the world, and we look forward to continue working with some of you in trying to generate the evidence showing that reforms actually can lead to very specific success that benefits governments and investors and citizens alike. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation, excellent presentation. Jean-Bulat Kakishev from Kazakhstan, Sovereign Wealth Fund of Kazakhstan. You showed an excellent graph where you showed the skills transfer versus the industries on your presentation. Some governments aspire to develop IT technology type industries. That's their aspirational vision.
Yes.
Even though the geographically they might be much more bound to be an agricultural hub. Exactly. So how do you bridge that gap between the aspiration of the government to be the innovative and
I'm glad you raised that. And actually, by the way, we are working with Kazakhstan as we speak.
You are, yeah.
So I think what we do is what we call a sector scan. Basically, there's, first of all, there's some conceptual clarifications we have to make. The graphic shows that, of course, this is an example where higher income, the more you go in services, the higher income can go. So maybe in IT and services may not be necessarily the best option for all the countries. There are other services that you can generate. And there are other even high income services in agriculture, as we were seeing in the previous sector. So what we do is that we do a sector scan showing what are the opportunities that are right now and the opportunities in the long term. Because I think that the key point is this is not a static exercise. The competitive advantage of countries go up and down today. Countries that work very competitive in something today, especially in knowledge intensive, can lose that competitive advantage very quickly. So what we do is a sector scan to show the desirability. Countries always want high tech, et cetera, but we do the reality check in the short term. And at the end of the day, I also want to clarify, it's not that we are advocating that everybody should doing IT services. No, it's that you have to diversify. Countries that have, like Kazakhstan, you have a huge potential in agriculture, but one thing is to export commodities, and another thing is like to follow the case of Chile. Chile no longer exports commodities. Chile managed to go from apples or grapes to wine, right? Or manages to go from salmon from Chile or Europe. It's not the same to produce sparkling wine than to produce champagne. There's a huge price difference there. So there's a lot of techniques to innovate in how to grasp higher value added. And we work with each government in each type of investment to generate that sector scan.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Roberto, just a quick question. Thank you very much for that very in detail report. I'm absolutely amazed when you talk about when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations that the richest was only 4 times richer than the poorest. The gap was only 4 times. I mean, and just if you can fast forward now, where's that gap now, considering that some companies have, returns the value of the GDP of some small countries? I mean, has that gap really increased in terms of the richest and the poorest? And what has the internet done to shift this? Because years ago, poor countries and people living there just knew life was tough and this was as good as it was going to get, because partly they did not know that there was a lot of activity going on elsewhere. Now they know, and there's huge social pressure within the country, and global social pressure, because so governments really don't have the chance to tell their people this is as good as it's going to get. Right. But the rich and poor divide, and then, I mean, what is technology and just that sort of the global village, so to speak, where everybody is connected? How's that shifting things?
The message, I'm glad that you pick it up, because it's a message that I would like to drill. The paradox that we're having is that if you compare the percentage of people in the world living under extreme poverty, understood as $1.5 per day, according to extreme poverty, we have never had less poor, ever, than today. If we continue, yes, poverty has decreased almost 40% in the last 15 years. And that's an explanation, China and India. Only in China and India, and even in some African countries, but in some, not in all. The majority, actually, Africa is a little, the bottom billion that stays. But the amount of extreme poverty in the world is decreasing significantly, to the point that if we continue growing as we're doing, we will reach the development goals. The problem is not then the extreme poverty. The problem is that even though you are less poor, right, the gap between the richest and the very poorest increases, which is a different qualitative phenomenon, right? So for example, today, if you take among the richest countries in the world, it tends to be small, by the way. Qatar is one of the richest. This one is one of the richest. And you compare with one of the poorest, which is basically the DRC, in Central African Republic. The gap is what is increasing. And then the answer is precisely what you said. The answer has a lot to do in technology, in applied technology, in the technology in the sense of whether that technology has an impact in the type of goods and services that countries export, or in the type of processes that they use to produce whatever they used to do. So for example, in DRC, or the technology, the way that they have used to cultivate it 70 years ago is still the same. While in countries that you also see agriculture, I mean, let's not go very far. I mean, in Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, they also live in agriculture, but the productivity per hectare is tremendously high because they have technology precisely that maximize the productivity of the same economic activity. So the challenge is, how do we integrate this bottom billion to this know-how? And our point is that it's not enough. I mean, you have to educate, you have to go to the way, but it's not enough. You need FDI. That's our point. We have discovered why, because that knowledge requires people working together empirically. And so our message to all the poorer countries, and today we have the bottom billion, it's not a coincidence that most of the bottom billion is concentrated in Africa and in South Asia. That bottom billion in the world that is still lagging in poverty, and that is the ones that have less investment. And if you see which are the countries that have grown faster in the last 20, 50 years, are countries that have received a lot, especially of efficiency-seeking FDI. Let me give you a concrete example. Singapore. Let's not go very far. 45 years ago, Singapore was poorer than most of the Central American countries today. In other words, in the 1950s, if you took Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, and you compare that with Singapore, Singapore was poorer. Ireland, Israel, Dubai, Qatar, I mean, a lot of economic, especially small countries. Mexico in 1980 used to depend on oil. 80% of the exports of Mexico were oil. Today is auto parts and avionics, right? What is the key? What is the difference? FDI. So that's basically what we mean. And then part of the problem is that when we talk to governments and we talk about FDI, a lot of governments tend to think that it's only mining. So they tend to say, oh, no, we don't want FDI because we have received a lot of FDI in the past and we are still under development. Well, the problem with mining also is that you have to have this cycle well administered to maximize the benefits of FDI. A lot of countries have benefited a lot from mining. Australia, New Zealand, Canada. But that's where we have to support the governments on that. Okay. Yes.
My question here, FDI is important for countries to prosper, but population and demand side is also important. So to attract FDI, how do you overcome the small population problem?
I'm glad that you raised that point. This afternoon, we're going to have a panel with different countries. Small countries will never have a big market, ever. It's impossible. If you want to attract market-seeking investment, you will attract some, but you will never have the possibility to grow inward-looking. So the solution for you is that you have to go for efficiency-seeking investment, because in efficiency-seeking investment, the investment goes to your country to export to the world market. Now, the challenge there in efficiency-seeking investment is a dream of every politician. See, contrary to market-seeking and to natural resource-seeking, if you have a lot of natural resources, you're already very attractive for investors. If you have a big market, you are very attractive to market-seeking. But in efficiency-seeking, the countries that are attractive are the countries that are so competitive that enable investors to go to that country as a platform to serve other markets. So you need two key conditions there. You need very high level of competitiveness in terms of investment climate. In that type of investment, the investor becomes a trader. This is extremely important to understand. So the investor will have to import and export. Now, this is the dream of every politician, because this type of investment only generates cash, only generates export, and is the highest potential to make the transformation that we are talking about. What is the challenge? Every country wants to attract this investment. Every country. This is the type of investment that President Trump is trying to actually prevent the US from leaving, right? But it's a competition, right? If you are attractive, you will attract this investment. So actually, we have also data that shows that the richest countries in the world are not the big ones, are the smaller ones. We have Qatar, we have Iceland, we have Switzerland, we have Liechtenstein, we have Luxembourg. Believe it or not, we will have, well, Dubai is becoming, the UAE is becoming one of them. So the key is to understand how your investment climate will help investors to export somewhere else. So you need to think not only your investment climate, you have to think, for example, in the regional agreements. Why? Because let me give you an example. When I was in government before joining the World Bank, I had once an investor. And this investor was basically going to my country to produce baseballs, okay? In my country, no one plays baseballs. No one. So this investor was telling me, Roberto, do you understand that I'm going to produce baseballs in your country? I say, of course, I do understand. Really? Yes, I understand. Well, do you realize that I'm going to export them? Yes. Yes, I understand. Really, do you? Yes, I do. No, you don't. I say, what do you mean? This was 20 years ago, okay? Any coincidence? It's just coincidence. 20 years ago, this investor said, do you realize that I want to export these baseballs to the US? Yes, I understand. No, you don't. I say, why? How do you know that tomorrow there will not be someone, hot-headed politician somewhere, that will say that the baseballs have to be made in America? And that they will stop or lift the tariffs for me to export baseballs. I need certainty that I will be able to export to the US. So that was the origin of the Central American-US Free Trade Agreement. That's how it works. So you have to provide access to these investors. So, for example, and it changes geography from geography. If you are, for example, in the Middle East, China, Russia, Africa, right, are key markets where investors might want to come here, not only to serve the region, to go somewhere else. Let me give you the last example, Ethiopia. We are working with Ethiopia, and believe it or not, in less than 10 years, Ethiopia will be the new China in Africa. Trust me. Ethiopia has managed to attract, and is very keen in build all the new value chain, not only of apparel, but textiles, and even cotton, all the way up. In less than 2 years, they already have made 5 industrial parks, and they managed to attract PVH and even Vanity Fair to work on these things. So they understand that these investors are going to serve Europe and are going to serve the US. So sooner or later, they will have to go into trade negotiations. That's why regionalism, and by the way, we have to strengthen having a multilateral system is strong as well, because trade and investment are coming together. And this is a very important point to realize. Investment used to replace trade, not anymore. Investment and trade are parts of international production. So for smaller countries, the smaller your country you are, the better trader you have to be. And the most successful ones have understood this very well. But even the big ones, okay? Okay, I don't know if I have time. I'm being told that I have to cut now, but I will answer your questions on a bilateral basis after we finish here. Thank you very much, and look forward to continue dialogue with you. Thanks.